Ladies and gentlemen, friends, colleagues, good evening. Namaste. Tashidele Kuzuzangbo. My name is Mark Turin, and together with Ratna Shrestha, Pasang Yangji Sherpa, Tiding Sakya, Catherine Hacker, Dagmar Schwerk, Elsie Lewison, and Sarah Schneiderman, I am one of the members of the UBC Himalaya Program Steering Committee. Next slide, please. We are generously and skillfully supported by our program assistant, Belinda Suen. And here we are, still on Zoom after all this time. While it would be so much better to see you all in person, to greet you, to meet you and re-meet you, we've decided that for now, still, out of an abundance of caution, that most of our events will continue in this way, digitally mediated, and we will continue to assess the situation as we proceed. Since this event is being recorded, I'd like to state for the record that I'm speaking to you on Monday, the 7th of March, 2022, from my home on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Hunkaminam-speaking Musqueam people in what is now called Vancouver in British Columbia, Canada. The very question of what it means to offer a territorial acknowledgement over Zoom across various time zones and different landscapes is complex, but it also offers us an opportunity to think critically about how we understand our responsibilities to the places that we live. Here at the University of British Columbia, we have the practice of not only acknowledging, but reflecting on our location on occupied Musqueam land, and remembering that Musqueam community members have been teaching and learning, living, nurturing these lands for thousands of years before our very young university was founded. And I'd like to thank the Musqueam community for the ongoing guidance and direction they continue to offer our university community, and particularly community-focused activities like UBC's Himalaya program in particular. Now, for those who are joining one of our gatherings for the first time, and we have a lot of attendees this evening, welcome. Let me take a moment to tell you just a little bit about what we do in the Himalaya program, why we do it, and also how we go about it. Next slide, please. The UBC Himalaya program draws upon faculty expertise, student engagement, and community partnerships to build an interdisciplinary hub for sharing knowledge about the whole Himalayan region that includes Bhutan, China, India, Nepal, Pakistan, and the Tibetan cultural zones that traverse all of those countries. Beginning in the fall of 2015, initial projects have included developing an intensive Nepali and Tibetan language and community engaged learning program that's operated for 5 summers now, with Tibetan classes continuing throughout the academic year. We host a regular speaker series and event series with leading scholars from around the world, like this evening, and we're quite committed to creating and co-developing the vision for an interdisciplinary network across our university, the lower mainland of this province, and into neighboring Washington state, for collaborative projects around research, student experience, and community engagement. It's been very satisfying to see such great interest and investment in our program from both undergraduate and graduate students, from alumni, community partners, as well as staff and faculty working on or from the Himalayan region. We're delighted to announce the dates for this summer's community engaged Nepali and Tibetan language courses. These courses will be offered through UBC's Department of Asian Studies as in-person courses with community interactions. But this, of course, will depend on public health orders and UBC policy closer to the time. For now, it's scheduled in person from May 16th to 27th, and it's an intensive schedule that includes community partnerships, learning opportunities. Please visit our website for more information on how to enroll. And while I have your attention, next slide, please. I would like to announce our next event entitled Reconnecting to the Himalaya, Connection and Conflict, in which 4 graduate students from the Himalayan region, all studying here at UBC, reflect on their experiences of knowledge acquisition and their changing positionalities in Western academia. They draw on a wide range of experiences, perspectives, and trainings in anthropology, journalism, environmental studies. And it's a round table exploring how these early career researchers connect, perhaps disconnect, and then reconnect back to their own region in the course of their studies, in the course of their research, and through their life beyond the university. It's scheduled for the 28th of March at 5:30 in the multipurpose room in the Liu Institute for Global Issues on the UBC campus. Now, to this evening. I am delighted that our first UBC annual Himalaya lecture is being delivered by Professor Karma Lekshe Tsomo. Our vision for this yearly lecture is to provide an open platform for sharing scholarly work and deep insights about the Himalayan region, and to connect with the general public and our Himalayan community partners here in Vancouver and in the lower mainland of BC. In particular, the Nepal Cultural Society of British Columbia, NCSBC, and the Tibetan Cultural Society, respectively. Alongside a public lecture, we invite our esteemed guests to connect with students at UBC by visiting and speaking in classes. And this year, that has led to Professor Tsomo making class visits to Asia 311 Tibetan Buddhism, as well as Asia 431 Tibetan literature, genre, and book culture, as well as a roundtable with 6 graduate students. This evening's event and the digital visit of Professor Tsomo has been co-sponsored by a number of different organizations. First of all, the Robert H.N. Ho Family Foundation in Buddhism and Contemporary Society, the Institute of Asian Research, the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs, the Department of Asian Studies, and a special grant we received from the Faculty of Arts who've supported this event. So with these preliminaries taken care of, I'd like to hand over to my colleague and friend, Dr. Dagmar Schwerk, to introduce our special guest this evening. Dagmar is the Kensei Foundation Postdoctoral Fellow in Tibetan Buddhist Studies here at UBC, and also the Himalaya Program Buddhist Communities Liaison. Dagmar.
Welcome, everyone, also from my side. Thank you, Mark, for your kind words as always. Some housekeeping notes before I introduce our speaker, Venerable Professor Karma Lekshe Tsomo. After a talk of about 45 minutes, Professor Sarah Schneiderman will moderate the Q&A session. Please use the Q&A function for questions you would like to ask our speaker, and use the chat function only for technical issues that may arise, or hopefully not. Please feel free to type in your questions anytime during the talk already so that we can start right away. Now, it's my great honor now, and I'm very excited to introduce today's speaker, Venerable Professor Karma Lekshe Tsomo, who, actually being so well known, hardly needs an introduction, and I fear any introduction naturally will be a little bit unsatisfactory in adequately recognizing her contributions. Nevertheless, I will try my best. Professor Tsomo is a renowned scholar and public intellectual in Buddhist studies and religious studies, and she is a professor at the University of San Diego, California. Her vast scholarship, publications, and teaching activities include areas such as, most prominently, of course, women in Buddhism, Buddhist feminist ethics, the construct of gender, and topics of 2S, LGBTQIA+, but also death and dying in Buddhist cultures, Buddhist bio and social ethics, and Buddhist transnationalism. Her newest book from 2020 is called Women in Buddhist Traditions, published by the NYU Press. It highlights the insights and experiences of women from diverse communities and traditions around the world, and chronicles crucial moments and strategies Buddhist women developed to challenge patriarchy from the beginning of Buddhist history until today. Professor Tsomo has been inspiring Buddhist women and female, non-binary, and male scholars around the world until today as a role model of how to integrate scholarship, Buddhist practice, and social activism. She is a co-founder of Sakyadhita, International Association of Buddhist Women, that began as a transnational movement in 1987, and she currently is the director of Sakyadhita Hawaii. Sakyadhita strives to reduce gender injustice and gender inequality that has, as we know all too well, manifested in poverty, illiteracy, insufficient healthcare, and abuse. Sakyadhita helps Buddhist women the daughters of the Buddha, so to speak, through, for example, education and healthcare. Furthermore, since decades now, biannual conferences have been bringing together lay women and nuns of all Buddhist traditions from around the globe and initiated important changes in Buddhist institutions. Over the last decades, through her social engagement, courage, and tireless efforts, Professor Tsomo has been significantly contributing to lasting positive changes for Buddhist women. She's also the director of Jamyang Foundation, an innovative education project for women in developing countries with scholars in the Indian Himalayas, Bangladesh, and Laos. Most probably right now, many in the audience recall their own personal, insightful, supportive, and often very joyful encounters with Professor Tsomo that have influenced so many of us female scholars and Buddhist women in how to be a female scholar, teacher, and mentor in today's world, and more generally, how to think about gender and Buddhism. For me personally, I first learned about Professor Tsomo's work when I volunteered as a freshwoman at the University of Hamburg at the important First International Congress on Buddhist Women's Role in the Sangha on the Bhikshuni Vinayan ordination lineages. It took place in the presence of His Holiness the Dalai Lama in Hamburg in 2007, and Professor Tsomo delivered her impressive keynote address pointing out the crucial link between gender equity in Buddhism and human rights. Today, she will talk about glacial shifts in both attitudes and institutions that have been taking place in Himalayan Buddhism and societies in recent years. Moreover, Professor Tsomo points out the ambiguous stereotypes women have been encountering in the Tibetan Buddhist and, of course, also in other Buddhist traditions and societies. Indeed, on the one hand, we find women as significant lay patrons and contributors to the transmission of Buddhist teachings throughout Buddhist history, or as symbolic representation of the highest wisdom, Prajnaparamita, and as awakened tantric practitioners who then, on the other hand, find themselves in the often questionable role as a dakini or as a consort of male tantric practitioners. Women's social reality throughout Tibetan Buddhist history has been complex and difficult, with a massive underrepresentation in Tibetan Buddhist institutions and the somewhat still unresolved issue of the nuns' full ordination, just to name two. So Professor Tsomo asks, how do we understand this paradox of those realities in patriarchal societal structures and Buddha's supposedly egalitarian teachings? For me personally, identifying both as a female scholar in Buddhist studies and Buddhist woman, this paradox is something that from the very beginning of my studies and work, both in Western academic institutions, but also Tibetan and Himalayan settings, has been confusing and quite honestly, sometimes difficult to navigate. On the eve of tomorrow's International Women's Day 2022, March the 8th, there's no better speaker to imagine than Professor Tsomo to also draw attention to this year's call that asked us all to, I quote, break the bias and celebrate women's achievement, raise awareness against bias and take action for equality, end quote. Today, Professor Tsomo joins us from Oahu, Hawaii, where she is currently working on creating the Lai Peace Center as a place for Buddhist studies, community service programs, and future peace education, more than ever needed in today's world. Now, without further ado, welcome once again, Professor Tsomo. We are very delighted to have you today as our inaugural speaker for the UBC Himalaya Program Annual Lecture, and the virtual floor is now all yours.
Thank you so much, Dagmar. I'm so delighted to be here with all of you. Tashidele and aloha from Hawaii. Here I would like to acknowledge that I stand on the traditional ancestral lands of the Hawaiian people, who have over many centuries preserved the cultural richnesses and the land on which we stand. So we're all very grateful and constantly learning more and more about Hawaiian culture and sustainable agriculture. That's what we're doing here. So this evening, I would like to lay out some of the background, the history and background of women in Buddhism. I have a lot of slides to show you. Perhaps I'll start out with just an introduction about Buddhism in Tibet and women's roles there, which are changing constantly. And although progress is a bit slow, in the infinite scheme of things, I think we can rejoice and be delighted in the changes that are occurring and continue to occur on the eve of International Women's Day. So, as most of you know, Buddhist texts and teachings were transmitted from India to Central Asian lands and Tibet as early as the 2nd century. And beginning in the 7th century, Buddhism traveled to Tibet over the Himalayas through what is now Nepal. These successive transmissions, based on Orthodox Buddhist teachings derived from India, took on distinctive characteristics and traditions as they were introduced and became naturalized in Himalayan regions and beyond. Throughout the centuries, in this process of transmission and adaptation, Buddhist women have been very active and devoted and have supported the cultural development of Buddhism in all of these regions. By tracing women's contributions then to this unique cultural transformation, we may discover many confluences, and including confluences with the current transmission of Buddhism to North America. So images of Tibetan monks are a familiar sight in the media, but only recently have Tibetan nuns come to popular attention. Tibetan nuns wear the same robes and live the same lifestyle as monks, but have never been as numerous or as visible in the tradition. Today, a seismic shift is occurring with significant changes for women everywhere, including Tibetan Buddhist cultures. As women gain new educational opportunities and confidence, they're entering monasteries in record numbers, outnumbering the monks, actually, and taking their place in the world's religious imagination. In the last few decades, scholars have uncovered the stories of remarkable women in the Tibetan tradition, providing fresh insights into the practices, perspectives, and accomplishments of realized women practitioners over the centuries up to today. Much has been lost, unfortunately, since ordinary women's practice has often been ignored or discounted. But the lives of a number of extraordinary women practitioners give us glimpses into the challenges women faced in gaining access to the teachings, and they shine brightly in inspiring other women. We have the examples of Mahaprajapati, the Buddha's mother, stepmother, and auntie. We have Gelong Mapomo in India. We have Orgen Chiki in Nepal, Yeshit Sogyal, Mandarava, Machik Labden, Something Dorji Pomo, Sarakandra, Tadi Lamo, and, just so many illustrious figures. And now English readers owe a great debt of gratitude for the translators who have made these biographies accessible to all of us. This is remarkable in English and gradually in other languages. The accomplishments of these extraordinary practitioners demonstrate that women are capable of achieving great spiritual heights and taking their place as teachers, translators, and spiritual mentors. Their biographies also reveal that women practitioners have encountered great challenges on the path to spiritual realization. Reading their stories reminds us of the multiple advantages that modern privileged women enjoy. Sometimes we forget. Literacy, leisure, confidence, independence, and material resources, as well as access to teachers. They also remind us of the many obstacles that hindered earlier generations of women in their quest for awakening, right? So it is inspiring to learn about the resilience and determination that women throughout history demonstrated in their efforts to realize the fruits of Buddhist practice. While it is disheartening to learn about the many obstacles that they faced, it's also encouraging that so many women were recognized for their spiritual achievements. So, in Buddhist philosophy, we're dealing with the transformation of consciousness. And consciousness, I submit, is not gendered. It's simply awareness, knowing, and awareness. So if men can become awakened, there's no reason that women cannot become awakened. In fact, the Buddha himself affirmed that women are fully capable of achieving the fruits of the path. So among the world's religions, I think that the Buddhists have one of the clearest statements that affirms women's potential for spiritual achievement. Yeah. So this is, I think, quite amazing. Now, next, we want to recognize it's not just in Tibet. We also have all of the different cultural regions where Buddhism spread, such as Nepal and Mongolia and Russia and Bhutan and Sikkim and so many other places, including today in North America and Europe and Australia, all around the world. So prominent female figures did emerge early, though, in the history of Tibet. In its creation myth, the Tibetan people are described as the descendants of a cave-dwelling ogress and the bodhisattva of compassion, Avalokiteshvara. The land of Tibet itself is identified as a wild, supine demoness who vehemently opposes the introduction of Buddhist teachings. For Buddhism to take root in this wilderness so that the benevolent Dharma could thrive, the demoness had literally to be nailed down and dominated by the construction of 13 Buddhist temples. Once she was subdued and Buddhism began to take root, illustrious women practitioners began to appear. At least 2 of the 5 consorts of the 7th century Dharma king Sonsen Gampo were earnest Buddhists. Geshe Sogyo became an acclaimed scholar practitioner, as well as the consort and biography of Pema Sambhava, the Indian tantric master who is often credited with establishing Buddhism in Tibet. Many tantric practices focus on enlightened beings and bodhisattvas in female form. So this is something quite unusual in the Buddhist world, that male practitioners will visualize themselves often in female form, just as women practitioners may visualize themselves in male form. So this is something of a gender bender, you could say. Many tantric practices focus on enlightened beings and bodhisattvas in female form who are visualized, supplicated, and revered by women and men alike. Female protector deities, such as Palden Lamo, for example, have been continuously venerated up to the present day. In Tibetan cultures, there's also a strong tradition of female oracles who serve as mediums, often for female gods. 2 women are the progenitors of the Chi and Nyungne practices. These are unique lineages that are really popular in the Tibetan cultural sphere and beyond. The practice of Chi, for example, cutting through the delusions of the mind, entails visualizing oneself, offering one's severed body parts to appease the cravings of sentient beings and satisfy their needs, and to cut through one's attachment to self-cherishing. Although Chi can be practiced by anyone, it has become a practice especially beloved by women, and it is traced to Machik Labdun, who, some say, may have special meaning for women practitioners, right? The practice of Nyungne. Oops, I've lost my place. Okay. Sorry. The practice of Nyungne, which is dedicated to the 1,000-armed Avalokiteshvara, entails observing 8 vows, chanting, and prostrating for 2 days, with fasting and silence on alternate days. The ritual originated with an Indian nun, known in Tibet as Gelong Mapomo, and Nyungne can also be practiced by anyone, but women have become especially accomplished and enthusiastic participants. In towns and villages throughout the length and breadth of the Himalayas and the steppes of Mongolia and Russia, women gather devotedly for Nyungne practices on special days in the lunar calendar. Some practice for the whole 4th lunar month. In the village temples. So Chi and Nyungne have become mainstays of Buddhist practice wherever Tibetan Buddhist audience influence has reached, from India to Siberia and around the world. One reason for the popularity of these practices among women is that Chi and Nyungne can be practiced individually and in small groups, in homes and village temples outside the male-dominated religious hierarchies and institutions that characterize the major Tibetan Buddhist lineages. So when we talk about institutions, we need to include all, and women find their way in all of this to navigate what is sometimes called high religion. They can opt out and practice on their own independently. These are some examples. Even so, despite the existence of illustrious female practitioners, enlightened exemplars, protector deities, and oracles in Tibetan-speaking societies, gender inequalities are very obvious. Women are reminded of their alleged inferiority every time they hear the word woman, which literally means lower birth. Women often internalize feelings of inadequacy that are reinforced in the social sphere, including religious hierarchies. Whether ignored or excluded, women are largely missing from the historical record after the 11th and 12th centuries. Throughout history, they have also been systematically excluded from learning institutions and the upper echelons of power in all 4 extant schools of Tibetan Buddhism, Nyingma, Kagyu, Sakya, and Gelug. Women have been allowed to attend most public Buddhist teachings, but until recently, few had access to formal Buddhist education and consequently understood only the broad outlines of the Buddhist teachings. Now, all of this is changing, but yeah. So ordinary women have not always had easy access to Buddhist practice lineages or retreat opportunities, unless a woman was born into or married into a family of scholars or skilled practitioners. Opportunities to receive oral transmissions and in-depth instructions in the practices were few. Even being born into or marrying into a family of scholars or advanced practitioners did not guarantee that one would gain access to Buddhist learning or practice opportunities. As can be seen from the biographies of realized women practitioners, a woman who entered into an intimate relationship with a tantric practitioner outside of marriage often faced obstacles, risks, and scorn. A female renunciant faced similar difficulties and discouragement from both her family and society, who preferred to see women in domestic roles. Monasteries for women were few, remote, and poorly supported. The term lama, meaning guru or teacher, was used only for males, and this is generally the case even today. The good news is that women have proven their dedication to the Dharma through sheer determination. In the last few decades, more Tibetan women in Tibet, Nepal, and India have completed intensive retreats than ever before. So traditionally 3-year retreats, but some are even longer. As educational opportunities have opened up, women have applied themselves diligently in mastering Buddhist philosophy, not an easy task, and have emerged triumphant. In December 2016, in the celebration held in Drepung Monastery in South India and attended by His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama, a crowd of thousands applauded the first 20 women in Buddhist history to earn Geshe degrees, the highest scholarly degree in Buddhism. This is such an achievement in women's history. I hope people are watching and recognizing this. Okay, so this accomplishment is inconceivable even 30 years ago, but they did it. They mastered it. Women throughout the Buddhist world are becoming respected teachers, translators, counselors, and spiritual mentors. With the blessings of the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas and the encouragement and generosity of kind Buddhist donors around the world, Tibetan women and other women practicing in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition are beginning to take their place in the pantheon of Buddhist masters. In the Tibetan tradition, most nuns take 36 precepts of a novice, just like novice monks. Whether because of their novice status, but they don't have access to full ordination yet. We're working on it. Whether because of their novice status or the lack of education and training, until recently, Tibetan nuns stayed quietly in the background, doing retreats, reciting prayers, performing rituals, and sharing the Dharma with those who came to them for counsel. In recent years, however, Tibetan nuns are taking new roles and seeking new opportunities that have begun to put them in the spotlight. Now, as you all know, in 1950, the Tibetan Buddhist world experienced a cataclysmic shift as the People's Liberation Army of the People's Republic of China invaded Tibet from the east. For the next 9 years, His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama and his government attempted to dialogue with Chinese leaders to ensure the security of Tibet and its unique cultural heritage. But ultimately, all attempts were unsuccessful. An uprising ensued in 1959, after which His Holiness the Dalai Lama and an estimated 100,000 people fled to Nepal and India. In the widespread popular resistance to Chinese communist occupation of Tibet, some nuns emerged as respected leaders. But as a result of political and religious restrictions, many nuns attempted the long, treacherous journey from Tibet to Nepal, frequently traveling from Nepal then to India. The heartbreaking stories they tell are a testament to their heroism and their devotion to their Buddhist beliefs. Many suffer lingering post-traumatic stress disorders as a result of rape, imprisonment, harassment, and surveillance by the People's Republic of China. Since the 1980s, Tibetan women have made substantial progress toward gender equity, especially in the field of education, both secular and religious, both in Tibet and in the diaspora. The increasing availability of general education for girls in Nepal and India parallels a global trend toward greater educational opportunities for nuns. These new opportunities have raised educational standards for girls and women across a broad spectrum of society. The establishment of co-educational institutions in India and Nepal have made education available to thousands of Tibetan girls and young women in India and Nepal. But there have been hindrances along the way for lay women as well as nuns. As recently as the 1980s, the highly regarded Institute for Higher Tibetan Studies in Sarnath did not admit women students. And even now, a quota is imposed on the number of female students to be admitted each year. So if we're going to look at gender equity, we have to look at all of it, right? Even so, because the Institute of Higher Tibetan Studies is an accredited institution of higher learning that prepares students as teachers, it is significant that opportunities have opened up for more lay women and nuns to study there. Many more female students who are not able to pass the entrance exam because they never receive proper schooling live around the institute and study privately. So despite circumstances of dire poverty and physical and psychological dislocation, a few monasteries for women have been established in India and Nepal. Of the over 300 monasteries in India, we have more than 20 for nuns. The hardships of adjusting to a new climate and cultural environment have been offset by the opportunity to meet and receive teachings from His Holiness the Dalai Lama and other renowned Tibetan Buddhist teachers. In exile, Tibetan nuns have not only had the opportunity to practice their faith freely without fear, but they've gained access to educational opportunities that were previously rare or non-existent in Tibet. Some in the 1980s, actually, Tibetan refugees arrived on pilgrimage in India and women here. And once they arrived, sought out public teachings and further higher education, Buddhist education. Now, so in addition to those novice nuns who were born in India, many young women have also come from Tibet, and after arriving in exile and meeting the Dalai Lama, have opted for a religious vocation. And for some, it was a natural response to their newly found freedom and the lessons they learned from undergoing tremendous hardships and suffering. So after one understands the fleeting nature of human life, the Buddhist teachings represent a profoundly meaningful way of life. Other young women who grew up in India came to the same realization through their encounters with secular life that promises happiness but does not always lead to fulfillment. So for most Tibetan women, the decision to enter monastic life is not the result of encouragement from their families or society. It's not because, as sometimes urban legend has it, that they're too ugly to find someone to marry them, or that they're deficient in some way. No, instead, the choice to devote their lives to Dharma practice is a personal choice to make the most meaningful use of the precious human opportunity. So now, mind you, the decision to seek ordination might also reflect a wish to avoid the potential hardships of domestic life. But in general, the nuns feel a deep commitment to help sustain Buddhist culture. In addition to their own personal practice, they feel a commitment to help sustain Buddhist culture, which is in danger of extinction in its homeland. So their commitment is spurred by the sad reality that Tibet's precious Buddhist cultural heritage may best be preserved outside of occupied Tibet. More than, I would say, 2,000 nuns now live in India and Nepal. Probably around 1,300 of them are Tibetan. But there are also many from the Himalayan regions who are culturally Tibetan, but politically fall into Indian territory and therefore have Indian passports. Yeah, so these are women from the Indian Himalayan border regions, such as Arunachal Pradesh, Kinnaur, Ladakh, Lahul, Spiti, Zanskar, Bhutan, Nepal, and elsewhere. So in Himalayan cultures and societies where monastics have primarily been monks, the road to full ordination has been arduous. Many fundamental disparities remain between the circumstances of nuns and monks, especially regarding education, access, and financial support. And the efforts to minimize these disparities are ongoing. Yeah, but one of the biggest struggles, of course, is to achieve full ordination. Now, many young nuns today, those born in Nepal and India, have had the benefit of public education, which many nuns born in Tibet did not have. But in the past 30 years, nuns in the Tibetan tradition have made significant strides academically, particularly in the study of philosophy, an area that was previously not open to them. Several nunneries now offer intensive education programs focused on philosophical studies. Some integrate ritual practices and intensive meditation retreats as well. I think I'm going to have to move on to the slides because of our time limitations. And I'll explain as we go along. Okay, why don't I shift over to the slideshow for people to get some visuals to accompany our discussion here. If you'll bear with me, I'll share the screen. And having presented this background, I think maybe the slides will be more meaningful. So here I start actually from the beginning, which is to say Mother Maya having a dream of a white elephant and conceiving in what could be considered a miraculous conception and giving birth to the young prince, the future Buddha, from her right side, unstained. He emerges unstained, untainted by the vaginal canal, which is considered by many to be polluted, right? There he is, emerging fresh and pure. So unfortunately, she passed away 7 days after his birth, according to the legend. But he was raised by Mahapajapati, his stepmother, who was also his aunt. And she subsequently became the first Buddhist nun. Now, here's a picture of the Buddha. This is Yashodhara, who was the Buddha's wife before he became the Buddha, and his young son, Rahula. So it wasn't as if he renounced the world after with no experience. In fact, he was married and had a child, and he knew all about worldly life. But he still had these questions about the meaning of life and an end to suffering. He also experienced, now the texts have various representations of women. Some are very positive, like motherhood, and some are somewhat, unflattering, like the story about his harem and seeing the women all lying around, drooling and snoring and so forth. And they say that this also was a factor in his decision to leave the palace. We don't know for sure, but in the end, he decided to leave. And whereas being a deadbeat dad, leaving your wife and newborn child would be frowned upon in most human societies, in Buddhist societies, it's called the Great Renunciation. And it's considered a tribute that he renounced his own family life, his own personal life, in order to achieve the highest goal, in order to benefit the multitudes, the many, all of humanity, in fact, and beyond. After 6 years of wandering in the forest, he was fasting and practicing ascetic practices to such an extent that he was really not able to concentrate. And he decided that it wasn't leading to his goal. So he decided to take the offering of a young woman named Sujata, who offered him rice pudding. And he regained his strength in order to cross the river, find a nice tree, sit down under it, and achieve the final goal of awakening. So here the images of women as nurturers of men, but also families and others. Now, while he sat under the tree, he was beset by what they call the demons of Mara, including young women who are portrayed as seductresses. So here we have an image of women as temptresses, and this is a recurrent image in the Buddhist texts, that women often dissuade men or tempt men away from their spiritual path. So that's there too. We have both positive and less positive images, right? After his awakening, the Buddha did teach audiences of men and women, including many thousands of nuns, many of whom became liberated beings, or arhatis. He described the perfect ideal Buddhist society as one that was composed of both lay men, lay women, renunciate men or monks, and renunciate women. This was the ideal for harmonious society. The Buddhist teachings were taken to Sri Lanka by the son and daughter of Emperor Ashoka in the 3rd century BCE. And this was a very important event in Buddhist women's history because his daughter was a bhikkhuni, fully ordained nun, and she took with her a sapling of the Bodhi tree and proceeded to ordain Queen Anula and many hundreds of women at the court in Sri Lanka. Now, the reason this is very significant is that from Sri Lanka, then, the lineage of full ordination for women was transmitted in the 5th century CE to China, where it was preserved until today. And thousands, actually it's estimated that millions of women have become ordained over the centuries. Now, in Tibet, of course, they have a unique culture, their own language, and amazing translations into Tibetan, which are so literal that you can almost translate back into Sanskrit. And this unique practice of debating philosophy, preserved only in Tibet during it was very popular in the 8th to 10th centuries in India, somehow was only preserved in Tibet. And they were so diligent in their practice, they would even sit in the snow to debate philosophy, imagine. Okay, so with its unique culture and literature and so forth, founding exemplars, the history of Tibetan Buddhism is very rich and meaningful, inspiring. It was also passed to many regions in the Himalayas, as I say. Now, here is an example from Zanskar, which is, turn left at Ladakh and travel over bumpy roads for 2 days, and you'll get to Zanskar, where they've managed to preserve Buddhism in a really quite pristine form. You'll see on the right, the monks' monastery, well endowed with lots of lands, agricultural lands, and donations and so forth through many generations. But the nuns' monastery here is very small. You can barely see it. They have no lands, no donors, very few donors. They do provide ritual practices, but their lives are really not easy. So there seems to be a preference for monks among the devout, and that has worked to the advantage of the monks. And so even in places like Mongolia, preference was given to monks to such an extent that we have trouble even finding records of any ordained nuns. Nevertheless, we have great practitioners like this 103-year-old woman who meditated throughout the Soviet era in isolation and achieved great realizations. And she came to our Sakadita International Conference on Buddhist Women in Mongolia, and we were amazed. So up in Zanskar, you see that the ordinary laywomen are also devout Buddhist practitioners. The 2 nuns on the right have been nuns since they were children, 6 years old, right? So women have really been practicing and really been upholding the tradition from its introduction. We started in 1993 with debate. People thought they just couldn't imagine women studying philosophy. It's just beyond anyone's expectations. But what has happened is really quite remarkable. These young nuns have taken very seriously, and they delight in learning, especially in learning the Buddhist teachings. Many of them don't want to go to school, to the public schools, because they're not teaching anything they're interested in. They're interested in Buddhism. I've tried to get them to, send them to public schools, but they prefer to stay in the monastery. So they learn, they have their own language. They also learn Tibetan and Hindi or Urdu, depending on the area. And sometimes I take them to international conferences where they're exposed to other Buddhist traditions. And they're really sincere. It's so amazing to watch them growing up and to see their progress. Very, very special. So here is the monastery we established in Bodh Gaya, where the Buddha achieved awakening. And Sanghamitra Institute is an attempt to provide a comfortable environment for Himalayan nuns to study during the winter months, when their homelands are covered with snow and they lack water and sufficient food supplies. They can come down to Bodh Gaya and have intramural debates on the intricacies of Buddhist philosophy. So it's very adorable to watch them and practice with them and speak with them. We have volunteer programs, and we've had many young people coming and older people coming from all around the world to share whatever knowledge they have. You see that succeeding generations live under one roof as a family, the elderly nuns as well as the young children, and their relationships are very endearing. It's quite remarkable. Yeah, so they study Tibetan texts, they recite prayers together, they do chanting hours every day. Sometimes I'll come in at 10 o'clock at night and say, are you still up? And I said, oh, yes. Tenzing's cousin brother's uncle died, and we're saying prayers for his fortunate rebirth. Imagine, they feel such love for all beings that they will stay up half the night praying for someone they may not have even met. And of course, many of them are young, so we ask them to, we give them an opportunity to draw their dreams for the future. It's very cute. We also introduce them to English so that they'll be able to have conversations. They would like to become teachers of Buddhism to the world. So we want to encourage them and support them in that. Nowadays, the nuns are in much better situation in terms of nutrition and housing. This is a wonderful thing. They have access to Buddhist studies. They are becoming leaders, really, in the community in areas where previously they would ask a monk to walk 8 hours to perform a funeral. Now, actually, they're inviting the nuns. These are small changes, but they're significant, that the nuns' practice is being recognized, that their pure hearts and their devotion are being recognized and encouraged. They're learning ritual practices as well as philosophical studies, dialoguing with people from around the world. Recently, these nuns achieved an award by the Indian government for their work to preserve Zanskari culture and environment. They were so proud. It was the first time that nuns had been invited to an Indian Independence Day celebration. So they took their place at the microphones. It was wonderful. Now, here are the first Tibetan geshes who were women. The first group that received this degree in philosophy, including 6 of my students, and they all have plans to teach or to become translators, to go into retreat, and they all plan to benefit in whatever ways they can. Many are multilingual, so we really appreciate their contributions. And they are not the last group of geshe-mas. There have been other classes that have graduated and achieved the degree since then as well. And that's an important thing too, that this should be ongoing. So thanks to the kindness of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, who really encouraged them from the beginning, from the early, even in the 1980s, he was encouraging them to study. Now, the one issue that is unresolved is the full ordination of women. So we are in dialogue with His Holiness and senior scholars in the Tibetan tradition to try to devise a way to make this possible. His Holiness himself would love to see a bhikshuni order in the Tibetan tradition. He asked us to convene this conference of 20 Vinaya masters from all the different Buddhist traditions to try to find a solution, a way that the ordination could be held. Unfortunately, we weren't able to, we would hope that there would be an announcement that now, having presented our research, it would be possible to hold an ordination in the Tibetan tradition, whether by monks alone or by, say, Vietnamese or Korean or Taiwanese masters, or perhaps a mixture of Tibetan monks and nuns from other traditions. So far, it has not occurred. So this is the foundation that we've been working through, but there are many groups that have been working to try to improve conditions for Buddhist women in the Tibetan tradition. And so I encourage you to seek them out and help support this exciting movement. And now I would be very happy to take questions. I hope there's still time to, yes, okay, wonderful. Good, I'm sorry I had to skip a bunch, but I hope you, whoops. Oh, wait a second. This is spotlighted your video. Okay, end of slide, so I'll click to exit. Okay. Okay.
Great. Well, thank you very much for this expansive talk. You've covered so much ground, and there's so much to learn from there. And for me, it's a wonderful opportunity to reconnect after so many years. We had the opportunity to meet, I believe, in 1995 at the Sakadita conference in Ladakh when I was still an undergraduate student, and it was really inspiring and eye-opening for me to see what you were doing with all of your colleagues as well, with Himalayan Buddhist women, and that has carried with me over all of these years. So thank you for bringing all of your wisdom and knowledge to us here today. It's my role to facilitate the Q&A here this evening, and I'm just going to start with a few questions and give our participants time to put their own questions in the Q&A. We have a couple here already. And I just want to encourage everybody who's listening to go ahead and type your questions in the Q&A if you haven't already. One of the questions that I had for you is about the relationship between the women who have become geshes, which you just showed us at the end, and their own communities. You spoke earlier about how women had often continued their practice as lay women precisely because these formal education opportunities were not available for them. And now it's so wonderful to see the women who have become geshes and who may be on the pathway to ordination, but it's still a very small number of women. So my question is, how do those opportunities and all of the change and transformation that you've seen, how does that connect back into communities and the overall experiences of women, particularly in Tibetan and Himalayan contexts?
Well, that has been very heartwarming because we find that, in fact, the community is very happy to see the nuns moving up. In the beginning, it was very difficult. I think that people really didn't realize the potential of the nuns or of women in general. But this is what I mean by the shift in attitudes as well as institutions, because shifts in attitudes is really important before we can start changing institutions. One of the most difficult things has been changing the attitudes of the nuns themselves towards their own capabilities. When we are raised to believe that we're somehow lacking or inferior or even worthless, then it takes some encouragement in order to gain confidence to go further. And what I found is that education is key. With education comes confidence. And now we see that, the nuns, before, they were so shy. They were afraid to really stand up in public gatherings, even to go to local government offices and so forth. But now they're no longer shy. And they are able to stand up for themselves. And the community is really recognizing their hard work. And attitudes have really changed a lot. So their relationships with the monks tend to be very close because, after all, they're related, right? They've got their brothers and cousins and uncles in the monasteries, and they help each other, which is remarkable now that they've taken their place at the table. Not completely, mind you. I mean, as far as I know, there are no officials in the Department of Religion and Culture that are nuns. But I hope that soon we will see changes like this. And it's not just in the Tibetan tradition. Korea is the only Buddhist institution. The Choge order has a couple of nuns in positions of authority institutionally. But in other Buddhist traditions, women are missing in action. So that is something that remains to be accomplished. So, and as I mentioned, they're inviting nuns to do rituals where before they would only invite monks. Of course, if they have a choice, they may still go for the monks, but gradually things are shifting in a really good way.
Thanks. Yeah, I felt privileged to observe some of those changes myself as well, and I think there is, a process of transformation ongoing, even if it takes quite a long time. I'm going to shift to questions in the Q&A, and I'm going to dive in the middle. Since we have quite a large audience here from different backgrounds, I'm going to go with some of the more general open-ended questions first, and then if we have time, perhaps come into some of the more detailed questions people have asked. So Easton has asked, do any of the 4 schools of Tibetan Buddhism allow women to receive the highest teachings?
Yes, generally speaking, women have access to almost all of the teachings. There may be some schools that do not share higher Tibetan tantric teachings with women, but generally speaking, the whole philosophical tradition is an open book. The challenge is that in order to read those books, we need to be educated, as we know, in the terminology and the meanings of the terms. Oh, since the beginning, since Tibet, women have been allowed to attend public teachings, women as well as men. But if you talk to people after the teachings, men and women alone, and you say, "Oh, how were the teachings today with His Holiness?" "Oh, they were wonderful. They were magnificent." So, "What did you learn?" And, "Oh, I didn't understand anything, but it was so wonderful. It was so magnificent." Right? So they see it as a blessing, even if they don't understand the intricacies of Buddhist philosophy. They can still understand the encouragement to think of others more than oneself, and to purify the mind and to create merit in order to achieve awakening. The basic outlines, I think everyone understands. But in the intricacies, you need education to be able to understand those concepts, yeah? And as I say, some tantric empowerments may also be closed to women. I heard this from Venerable Tenzing Palmo, that she had trouble getting certain initiations and had to go to a different school to get them. So, yeah.
Thanks so much. And there's a few more questions around the specifics of establishing the Bhikkhuni order and ordination for women. So an anonymous participant has asked, please kindly clarify the issues with establishing the Bhikkhuni order in Himalayan Buddhism. What are the main obstacles and concerns? And Catherine March has said, thank you very much for your presentation. I'm particularly curious to know with a little more precision what the main arguments you think are that should be pursued in supporting the ordination of women and the related issue of the possibilities for achieving enlightenment as a woman. And she's gone on to mention that when His Holiness the Dalai Lama spoke at Cornell in 1991, she asked him what women could do to get ordination and achieve enlightenment. And his reply, work for rebirth as a man, was seriously discouraging. So I think people would like to hear a little bit more about some of these specifics, like what are the obstacles that are preventing this from going forward, and how do we work with some of the kinds of attitudes that are mentioned there.
Okay. Well, first of all, I've never heard His Holiness give that answer. He may have been joking, because he knows very well that women have the potential to achieve awakening. But he often, he may have been joking in that case. The issues of full ordination. Okay, let's take the issue of enlightenment first, because if you're seeking liberation, everyone has consciousness. All sentient beings have consciousness, and it's possible to purify our consciousness of all the delusions of the mind and to become liberated from delusions, liberated from suffering, and liberated from rebirth. Men and women equally can do that. We know this from the very earliest strata of texts, that many women achieved the state of an arhat or arhati, and this was recognized by the Buddha. So this is no issue. The issue is whether a woman can become a fully awakened Buddha. And in general, in the Mahayana tradition, they say that all sentient beings can become Buddhas. So that is also not an issue. It's just that conditions on the ground don't always make it easy for women to actualize that. There was one school that said women could not become awakened as a Buddha, but that school has died out, the Mahasashika. So I think that we can but there's still some controversy. Not everyone may agree, but we do have examples like Tara and so forth of fully awakened women, especially in the tantric tradition. So maybe not necessary to pray to be reborn as a man. Now, the issue of ordination is very complex, and we could spend a few hours on it. So I will try to summarize it, but understand that this is an issue of monastic law. It's not simply an issue of gender discrimination, though it may also be that. Meaning that there is a procedure that is prescribed in the Vinaya, in the monastic codes, about how an ordination is to be performed. For monks, for fully ordained monks or bhikshus, it's ordination by 10 bhikshus. For a nun, it's ordination by 10 bhikshus and 10 bhikshunis. And this was sort of the price of admission that the Buddha's stepmother paid in order to join the Sangha. She agreed to these 8 special rules, and one of them was that she agreed to be ordained by both bhikshus and bhikshunis. Now, the whole thing is very odd. It's all legend, for one thing. We have no written sources, historical sources documenting it. But it's also odd because there were no bhikshunis at that time. She was the first. So how could he require her to be ordained by both bhikshus and bhikshunis when he himself ordained her? He alone ordained her. There were no 10 bhikshus and 10 bhikshunis. So this sort of incongruence has been pointed out in several studies. Be that as it may, we're left with a situation that, according to the texts as we have them, the bhikshuni should be ordained by both 10 bhikshus and 10 bhikshunis. And in the Tibetan tradition, which follows the Mula Sarvastivada Vinaya, which is a later recension, it actually says 10 bhikshus and 12 bhikshunis. So now, how can this be accomplished? First of all, there are those like Bhikkhu Nalio from Germany who says that, in fact, ordination by bhikshus alone is fine under certain circumstances. And there are cases in the Vinaya where this was done and it was accepted. Okay, so that's one. The Tibetan bhikshus could by themselves ordain the first group of nuns as bhikshunis. And then after that, once you have a cohort of bhikshunis, then subsequent ordinations could be conducted by both a full quorum of 10 bhikshus and 10 bhikshunis, or 12 if they want 12. Okay. Now, the other option that we've pointed out in our multiple research papers that we presented to the Tibetan government is that they could go to Korea or Taiwan or Vietnam or Paris or New York or Los Angeles and receive the ordination from the Taiwanese masters or Vietnamese masters or Korean masters. I myself went to Korea. I was headed to Taiwan, but I happened upon a dual ordination. By dual ordination, I mean ordination by 10 bhikshus and 10 bhikshunis. And since it was being done in that way, and I knew that that would matter to the Tibetans in terms of establishing the ordination in the Tibetan tradition, I mean, to do it according to the book, you see, then I opted to take the ordination in Korea. Later, I went through the ordination process to see how they conducted it in Taiwan also. So the third option would be for Tibetan bhikshus to offer the ordination along with 10 or 12 bhikshunis who have been ordained as bhikshunis in other traditions, such as the Korean tradition, Taiwanese tradition, or a Vietnamese tradition, right? For the first instance, the ordination could be offered in this format. Yes, they belong to different Vinaya lineages, and some will make that a point. It's interesting how they're very concerned about the fine points of Vinaya when it comes to the ordination of women, when it's not normally in the conversation. It's not normally a huge concern. But when it comes to the ordination of women, very specific. They want to be very precise. So these are the 3 options that we've set out. And we hope that attitudes are shifting, changing. But you see, part, I think, of the opposition is that it would represent a major change in institutions, right? The Tibetan Buddhist institutions have been going along just fine for hundreds of years. And in exile, the Tibetans are very concerned about preserving these institutions. This would be a major upheaval in the tradition. And His Holiness Dalai Lama has been handling these upheavals very nicely. When nuns started to outnumber monks in the Suklakang in Dharamsala, he built a second temple for them. This is one way to deal with it, you see. And there are ways to try to cope with the changes. But, as we see in the halls of our own government, it's not so easy. So to make these kinds of cataclysmic shifts, but we're working on it, and we hope that people will support that. It's funny that you asked that question, because in many public gatherings, the first question that he gets is, Your Holiness, what about the ordination of women? Again and again and again. So let's keep asking. Respectfully.
Great, thanks so much. And the response that you just gave connects with several of the other questions that we have, which are around the globalized nature of Tibetan Buddhism today and how different kinds of value systems, in a sense, intersect. So there are several questions around this theme. Ashley writes, how do we support Tibetan women in religious equity without forcing Western ideals of feminism on them and their culture? An anonymous participant has asked, as the Sangha moves into a much more globalized one, how do you see the role, how do you see the role of ordained women shifting and changing, especially when it comes to non-monastic practitioners? And this question comes from my personal interactions with women practicing Vajrayana in Western cultures who bemoan the lack of experienced female voices when it comes to completion stage practices of Niguma, Sukhasiddhi, and Naropa. And then from Tsering Watermeyer, the question, how much of the shift in institutions towards nuns is seen as necessitated by conditions of diaspora and ongoing challenges if maintaining religious continuity is part of Tibetan culture? So I think many people are curious about that, the intersection of Tibetan cultural practice with Buddhist religious ideals and norms, and then with the shift in location or the sort of globalization and dissemination of Buddhism to the West as well.
Oh, these are three huge questions, each one of which deserves a book, I suppose. The first one about Western imposition. This has been raised, this allegation has been raised that Western women are imposing our values on poor, unsuspecting Asian women who are just fine with cooking and cleaning for monks. And I find it a bit odd, in fact, as if women in other cultures do not recognize their own oppression, as if women do not understand their own second-rate status in their own societies. In fact, my experience of living in these communities for 15 years shows that they're highly aware of their situation, and they have their own ways of resistance. I have not met any, there have been some misunderstandings. I know one case where someone who was not interested in full ordination didn't see the importance of full ordination for women. And this was taken to mean, this was understood to mean that women in the Tibetan tradition are not interested in full ordination. It was simply a misunderstanding, but it went out through, the waves and was repeated endlessly. In fact, privately, the nuns I speak to would be very happy to receive full ordination. They would like to get it from their own teachers rather than go to a different Buddhist tradition, which I respect, right? That's why we're working on trying to transform attitudes within the Tibetan institutions. As far as non-monastic traditions, I think that many women are taking their places. There are so many different lineages, so many different practices, so many different centers. I think it would be very difficult to generalize about how things are changing. There are many books underway right now that are seeking to explain more about the adaptations of Buddhism in the West. I'm rather traditional in this way. I think it's important that we study the tradition on its own terms before we start trying to adapt it and reinterpret it and condemn it. I think it behooves us to understand this wealth of religious literature and to engage in the practices and to try them out for ourselves, to see. And then, of course, we're going to, the traditions are going to change when they come to a society that they've been changing all the time. Throughout Buddhist history, they were probably changing from the beginning. It's impossible to imagine that the tradition has been static all these 2.5 millennia. Any tradition that's static doesn't last very long. It has to respond to the needs and interests of the populations. So this may be the most stark contradiction between traditional Buddhist practices and teachings and modern Western culture, which I won't even attempt to generalize because that too is so varied. In terms of cultural continuity, I think, and reception in the West, I think that the ordination of women is important. Not only the ordination or access to full ordination for women is important, not only for women themselves, but also, and to give them opportunities, equal opportunities to practice in the tradition, but also the perception. You know, the optics are not good when people talk about human rights, but don't accord human rights to their own women. And if women do not have full religious rights, they do not have full human rights, if you follow my logic. Therefore, in order to claim that the tradition accords human rights to all, it should also make accessible the religious rights for women. So that's my position, and I'm sticking with it.
Thanks. And there was a kind of a last question in that series, which was about how the shift in institutions towards nuns is necessitated by the conditions of diaspora, and if maintaining religious continuity is part of Tibetan culture. So, I mean, I suppose we could think about it as a kind of counterfactual too, like how would the situation be if there were not an exile or a diasporic kind of consciousness, and how do you see that element interfacing with the sort of overall shift in attitudes towards women?
Well, that's a hypothetical. We cannot know what it would be, what the situation in Tibet might have been without the diaspora. We cannot know. I realize that I've focused a lot on nuns, probably because I'm speaking from my own experience and the communities that I interact with on a daily basis now. They've all got, they can communicate by phone, so I'm in constant contact with our monasteries. But I think also, in fact, the changes are beneficial, and they're ongoing, and they're creative, and we will necessarily see changes occurring that will be good for all. They'll be good for the nuns in India and in Tibet. In Tibet also, there's a lot of scholarship on women's biographies. I guess you've heard these more than 80 volumes. They're helping to recover the stories of awakened women in Tibet. And so this is not limited simply to the diaspora. The one reason to focus on nuns is simply the fact of equal opportunity. Also, a cultural sort of preference for monastic practice overall, though there have always been non-monastic practitioners. But it sort of is still a cultural symbol to see monastics, and they are still respected. Of course, they're not perfect, but this, I think, is, it's positive. It's a positive thing to give. If women have equal rights, or equity at least, in the monasteries, it sends a signal to women in other ways of life, other stations in life, other occupations in life. It also is an inspiration to them. So I think, it's a good thing to acknowledge that, if we take the tradition on its own terms.
Thanks very much for that. There are a couple of questions around ideas of embodiment and pollution that I think we could consider together. The first one is from Emily, who writes, I'm wondering how women monastics or nuns are taught to process issues around sexual desire, considering that male monastics were often encouraged to see women as decaying meat and to think of women's bodily disintegration or excrement to keep away from attachment. This always struck me as obviously problematic, and I wanted to know if female sexuality was acknowledged as a challenging form of attachment for women monastics as well, or is it treated differently? And how is this treated culturally alongside a spiritual practice that has a sacred practice, like karma mudra and yogic non-dual union as a regular representation in the tradition? And finally, how does this larger history relate to the root tantra vow number 14 on not despising women whose essence is wisdom? And then another participant has written, in Theravada Buddhist practice, especially in some cultural contexts, not in all, I presume, menstruation is often connected to profanity that restricts their access to practice Buddhism or discourages them to pay homage to the venerables. Just wondering in Tibetan Buddhism how this aspect is seen, practiced, and challenged. So questions around sexuality, menstruation, and bodily experience.
Okay, so here we have another book in the making. Anyone need a dissertation topic? You've raised about 10 different issues and in these questions, and so all I can say is, like, embodiment is a fraught issue in that we need a body in order to practice, and we're fortunate to have a human body, which is absolutely the best possible vehicle for practice. The issues of pollution, women's pollution, seriously, human bodies are pretty much all composed of the same sort of disgusting substances. And at the Buddha's time, you see, mostly he was speaking to audiences of monks. And he was trying to remind them to maintain the voluntary commitment that they had made to celibacy. So he asked them not to look at women, not to speak with women, and to try to maintain their precepts, right? And the same would apply to women. If the Buddha had been talking to an audience of nuns, he probably would have framed this in the opposite gender, to meditate on the polluted nature of the male body. We know that in some Buddhist societies, there are pollution taboos. For example, in northern Burma, northern Thailand, there's certain temples that women are not allowed to enter. Even in Ladakh, there are still a few. And in Bangladesh, I've also encountered it. I usually get in because I'm old and I'm a nun. But for young menstruating women, sometimes there are taboos that I believe are pre-Buddhist. You don't find this in the Buddhist text. In the Buddhist text, men's bodies and women's bodies are equally disgusting, and they're all going to decompose. So, yeah. So, of course, this is a kind of contradiction. We need the human body. It's a magnificent opportunity. At the same time, we recognize all these different leaking substances we all keep taking showers to avoid. And so now the issue of sexual attraction, of course, is dealt with extensively in the texts. To understand, there's the story about the monk who became ordained, but he kept thinking about his wife during meditation. He just couldn't get her out of his mind. And so eventually he went to the Buddha and said, I'm just not getting anywhere with my meditation. I keep thinking about my beloved wife. And as the story goes, the Buddha took him up to the Deva realms, and he showed him the female devas. And the devas are so exquisite that when they returned to earth, the monk saw his wife looking something like a monkey, and he completely got over his sexual desire and went on to achieve realization. So sexual attraction is understood as desire, and it is something that we can control. This might be a useful sort of message for young people today. It's often portrayed in Western society that the sexuality is necessarily a positive thing. Sexual desire is necessarily a positive thing, and even you can take medicine to make it, greater. But this is quite in contradiction to the Buddhist text, which is that sexual desire can be a hindrance in meditation. Now, of course, in the tantric text, it's used as a vehicle, and that's another subject in itself that one has to study on it again, according to the texts and practices of those traditions. But in general, it's due to sexual attraction and desire that we take rebirth again and again and again. As we were discussing in the last talk, last evening, Friday, sometime, that according to the medical texts, it's this attraction to the mating of the man and the woman that causes us to take rebirth again and again and again. Whereas if we can get over sexual desire, we can get free from this repeated rebirth. That's the story. That's the basic teaching. And so we can deal with it. Each one of us needs to deal with it individually. But they would not, encourage the creation of more desire. Where will that lead? So we have to use our logical reasoning. You see, that's the beauty of the Buddhist tradition, to think these things through for ourselves, and make our own decisions. Huh?
Thanks. There's one more question around these themes, which I missed earlier from Zopa, who writes, "Dear Venerable, thank you so much for your work. There seems to be another unresolved issue for all of us, monastics and lay, and that is the sexual abuse of women that seems to be still tolerated in the Tibetan lineage, especially of lay women and nuns. Can you speak to that and let us know what we could do to affect change? I mean, especially by Tibetan male teachers." So another angle in terms of thinking about sexual desire and the potential violence of that towards women.
Well, I believe that sexual abuse should never be tolerated. Sexual exploitation should not be tolerated. If it goes on, I think we have to recognize it and call it out. His Holiness the Dalai Lama has been very clear that if we see transgressions by teachers, we not only are allowed to mention it, we are obligated to mention it. Now, I come up against this a lot because in counseling young women, I may find that they're intending to go to a retreat with someone that I know is not reliable. And before it was very difficult, because if you said, well, be careful, they'll say, why? And I said, well, because, it was very difficult, right? Very awkward. Nowadays, you can go to the internet pretty much and find out if a teacher is reliable or has, we don't know if someone has been accused does not necessarily mean that they're guilty of the offense, but at least it would allow us to observe the person's conduct. And this is what we're called to do at all levels. There are certain qualities of a teacher. Sometimes there's a list of 10, sometimes there's a list of more. The minimum qualifications are ethical conduct, according to the Buddhist prescriptions. At least minimum 5 precepts of a layperson, right? Which includes no sexual misconduct. Second, great compassion. Third, the person should know more than you do. So in order to be a teacher, these are the 3 minimum requirements, right? Now the situation becomes a bit confusing when someone wears robes and a shaved head, but is not a monastic, does not have the monastic, or is not observing the monastic precepts carefully. This can be very confusing. I think it must be very confusing for the person himself. I don't know any female examples, but it's very confusing for the public and for the students of that teacher. I think that those who are lay people should wear something else, frankly. I'll go on record here. That those who are wearing the robes of a monastic should keep the precepts that they voluntarily committed to keep. this would go a long way in protecting women from sexual assault, sexual exploitation, and sexual abuse. So here, I do believe, and this may be controversial, that women have a responsibility to check the qualities of the Lama and to be careful when they enter relationships with a teacher or with anyone, right? To make sure that they are conducted at the highest level of integrity.
Great, thank you so much for that. We're running out of time now. I would just, excuse me, I would just like to take one final question in a bit of a different direction, and I hope we could conclude on this one from Darcy, who asks, could Venerable Lekshe share how the nuns are faring through the world pandemic? Are they able to travel back and forth from Zanskar? And I think it would be wonderful to hear whatever you can offer in terms of a very current update from the nuns with whom you work in the Himalayan region. Thank you.
Yes, the nuns are adapting very well. They are being very careful. They are vaccinated. They're wearing masks. They're in any situation. Mostly they're staying in the monasteries. All of our nuns are carefully staying in the monasteries. Populations like Zanskar and Spiti and Kinur are very small. 20,000 people in Spiti could get wiped out in, very quickly. So they're very much aware of the dangers. And the Indian government has been very good in providing vaccinations to the people in these areas. In the beginning, there were quite a few difficulties. Our nuns were under lockdown in Bodh Gaya, and the Himachali government sent buses to take them back to their monasteries. So they've been staying very quietly, eating mostly sampa, really, during the last couple of years. And even being careful about going to the bazaar to get vegetables and things. And so far, so good. A few nuns did travel from Zanskar to Leh to accept the award, where they were honored for their good work in preserving culture, Ladakhi culture and environment. So, but that was something of an exception. And they traveled by private vehicles to stay safe. So thank you for your concern. One problem is that, of course, donations have declined during the pandemic. People have uncertain economic futures, and therefore they may be hesitant to support different projects as they might ordinarily. And so we're having to try to find solutions to that. But they are praying for the world continuously, morning and evening, sometimes all day, for the health, for everyone's good health and happiness in this difficult time. So just to let you know that the nuns are praying for you. Yes. And we all hope that you stay well and healthy. And they feel a special obligation as Buddhist practitioners. Here they've studied so hard for 30 years. They don't want to jeopardize that. They know they've got a treasure to share with the world. So they want to be very careful to stay well.
Thank you so much. I think that's a beautiful note to end on. And I hope that everybody here can stay well and take with them such wonderful learning and information that you've shared. I'm sorry that we haven't had time for all of the questions. There are a couple more there in the Q&A. But I hope we've covered a great deal of ground, and thank you for taking them all in such a spirited and eloquent fashion. You have many thanks in the Q&A as well. Thank you for the incredibly beautiful and wonderful talk, and amazing and eloquent enunciation and articulation of concepts that are so laden with meaning. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. And I think that articulates my feelings as well. So with that, I would like to thank everybody also for sharing their thoughts here this evening and for participating. For those who are interested in more of our future programs, please do sign up to the newsletter email list of the UBC Himalaya program. We will be sending out updates around our future events. And I would like to thank you very much for being here with us. It's such a great honor. And I just hope that next time we can once again meet in person. Hopefully all of those prayers that you mentioned will do their work. Thank you.
Thanks to everyone who helped make this possible. It was wonderful. Under difficult circumstances, I appreciate all of you. Have a very wonderful, happy Tibetan New Year.
Absolutely. And International Women's Day.
Yes.
Yes. Thanks so much. And it's, yeah, an hour and a half has gone by so fast. And I wish we could keep you here speaking all night. As you said, many of these topics could deal with a few hours or a few books by themselves, which of course is true. There's so much more to learn. Oh, I see that Belinda has put the link for the newsletter in the chat. Thank you very much. And you're receiving very many thank yous from all over the world. I think it's been wonderful to have all of our participants here. I can recognize several names from UBC, but I think we've also got a wonderful complement of people in the Zoom world, which is one of the positive things that has come out of being able to host events like this. So thanks everybody who's been participating this evening.